30,000 feet in the air. Both pilots were unconscious. The plane was falling, and every adult on board was out of options. Until a 12-year-old black girl from a small apartment with a second-hand flight simulator quietly walked into the cockpit and took the controls. Nobody handed her the seat. Nobody voted on it. She just knew something the rest of them didn't. And what she knew was about to save 200 lives and expose the truth behind her father's death. The gymnasium at Eastfield Community Center smelled like floor wax and folding tables. Someone had strung a banner across the back wall. Bright blue letters on white paper. STEM Stars Youth Expo. Inspiring the next generation. Half the letters were slightly crooked. The people who'd put it up had clearly been in a hurry. Zariah Washington stood near the back of the room with her arms folded, watching. She was 12 years old, small for her age, with close-cropped natural hair and dark brown eyes that moved across a room the way a camera pans, slowly, deliberately, taking everything in. She wore a plain gray hoodie and sneakers that had seen better days. She didn't look like someone you'd notice at first. That was fine with her. The flight simulation booth was set up near the far wall, and it had drawn the biggest crowd of the afternoon. A man named Mr. Pryor, the kind of adult who introduced himself with a firm handshake and talked loudly even in quiet rooms, was leading a group of about 15 kids through a demo on a laptop mounted to a folding stand. He had a pointer. He used it often. Now, Mr. Pryor said, tapping the screen, when a pilot wants to initiate a descent, they push forward on the yoke, this control here, and that nose goes down. Simple physics. The plane follows the nose. Zariah's eyes narrowed. She unfolded her arms. She'd been listening for about 3 minutes. In those 3 minutes, she'd heard 2 things that weren't quite right and 1 thing that was flat out wrong. She told herself to stay quiet. She always told herself to stay quiet. But the third thing, the idea that a descent was simply a matter of pushing the nose down, full stop, no other variables, sat in her chest like a splinter. She raised her hand. Mr. Pryor didn't see it. He kept talking. She raised it higher. A girl next to her nudged her friend and whispered something. They both glanced at Zariah. "Excuse me," Zariah said. Not loud, not rude, just clear. Mr. Pryor paused. He looked over. "Yes. That's not complete," she said. "When you initiate a descent, you can't just push forward on the yoke without adjusting your power setting. If you pitch down without reducing thrust, you're going to overspeed. You have to manage both simultaneously, attitude and power. They work together." The room got that particular kind of quiet that happens when something unexpected cuts through the noise. Mr. Pryor looked at her for a moment. Then he smiled, the way adults smile when they're about to explain something they think you don't understand. "Well," he said, "this is a basic demonstration. We're simplifying things for the audience." "I understand," Zariah said. "But if you're teaching kids aviation, even a simplified version shouldn't have errors. Someone might remember this and think it's how it actually works." Someone in the crowd laughed. Not with her, at the situation. At the 12-year-old correcting the instructor. Mr. Pryor's smile tightened. "Maybe you'd like to come up here and run the demonstration yourself?" He said it the way people say things when they're sure you won't take them up on it. Zariah walked up to the table. She sat down in front of the laptop. The simulator was a consumer-grade program. She'd used better ones, but she knew the interface. She set up a scenario in about 30 seconds. Cruising altitude, standard conditions, a descent request incoming from ATC. Then she talked through it as she executed it. Power reduction first, trim adjustment, pitch controlled, rate of descent steady, airspeed stable within limits. She narrated each step plainly, without showing off, like someone explaining how to tie a shoe. When she finished, the plane on the screen leveled off at exactly the target altitude. She stood up and stepped back from the table. The room was quiet again, but differently this time. Mr. Pryor cleared his throat. "Where did you learn that?" "My dad," Zariah said. And then she walked back to where she'd been standing. Nobody laughed that time. The Monday after the STEM Expo, Zariah sat in the chair outside Principal Graves' office at Lakeview Middle School. The chair had a small crack in the vinyl along the right armrest. She'd sat in it enough times to have noticed. Principal Graves was a round-faced woman with reading glasses she wore on a beaded chain around her neck. She leaned forward across her desk with an expression that was genuinely trying to be sympathetic but wasn't quite making it. "Zariah," she said, "your teachers have real concerns. It's not about your intelligence. Everyone agrees you're bright. It's about engagement, about how you interact with the classroom." Zariah didn't say anything. "Mrs. Ellison says you corrected her in front of the class again last Tuesday. She said the Wright brothers flew for 30 seconds at Kitty Hawk. It was 12 seconds on the first flight. That may be accurate, but it's a facts class. The fact was wrong." Principal Graves set down her pen. "You see, This is the pattern. It's not what you're saying, it's how you're coming across. You're quiet, you're withdrawn, and then when you do speak up, it feels combative to the other students. And to the teachers. Zariah looked at the wall behind the principal's head. There was a framed poster of a mountain with a motivational quote at the bottom. She'd read it so many times she could recite it from memory. "I'm not trying to be combative," she said. "I'm just not interested in pretending things are true when they're not." Principal Graves sighed, a long, patient sigh that carried a lot of tired history in it. "I've spoken with your Aunt Danielle. We both think it might help if you join some group activities. The science club, maybe. Something social." Zariah nodded once. Not because she agreed, because the conversation was clearly done. She stood up, picked up her backpack. "Can I go back to class?" Principal Graves watched her with an expression that was difficult to read. "You know," she said quietly, "it's okay to let people in sometimes." Zariah paused at the door. "I know," she said, and left. Danielle Washington was 34 years old and had been raising Zariah for 2 years, and she still hadn't completely figured out how to do it. She'd grown up as the easy sister, the one who laughed quickly, made friends without trying, moved through the world with a kind of uncomplicated warmth that her older brother Marcus had always admired. Marcus, who had been careful and quiet and brilliant, who had loved his daughter so much that even watching him with her from across a room felt like witnessing something private. And then Marcus was gone, and suddenly the careful, quiet, brilliant little girl was Danielle's responsibility, and nothing in Danielle's life had prepared her for it. She sat at the kitchen table that evening with a mug of tea going cold beside her, watching Zariah eat dinner across from her. The apartment was clean, but not large. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that doubled as a dining room, windows that looked out onto the parking lot of the building across the street. "Mrs. Graves called me," Danielle said. "I know," Zariah said. She was reading something on her phone while she ate, some kind of aviation manual. Danielle could see the diagrams. "Can you put that down for dinner?" Zariah put it face down on the table. Danielle wrapped both hands around the mug. "Baby, I'm not trying to get on you. I want to understand what's going on at school." "Nothing's going on." "That's not what Mrs. Graves says. Mrs. Graves thinks I'm difficult because I don't pretend to agree with things I don't agree with." Danielle pressed her lips together. "You know what she said to me?" She said, and I'm quoting, "Zariah seems like she's somewhere else most of the time." Zariah picked up her fork. "Put down again. I'm fine. Aunt Danielle. You're 12 and you spend every evening in your room with that flight simulator, and you don't have any friends that I know of, and I have friends. Name one." A pause. A small, honest pause that said more than Zariah wanted it to. Danielle softened. She reached across the table and touched her niece's hand. "I know you miss him," she said. "I miss him too. Every single day. But sweetheart, I worry that the planes, the simulator, all of it, I worry it's not helping you move forward. I worry it's keeping you stuck." Zariah looked at her aunt's hand on hers for a moment. When she looked up, her eyes were calm and steady. "It's not keeping me stuck," she said quietly. "It's the only thing that makes sense to me." Danielle didn't have an answer for that. She let go of her hand and picked up her cold tea, and they finished dinner in silence that wasn't quite comfortable, but wasn't entirely uncomfortable either. Later that night, after the apartment had gone quiet and the strip of light under Danielle's bedroom door had gone dark, Zariah went to her room and sat down at the desk in the corner. The simulator setup was more serious than what most 12-year-olds would have assembled. She'd spent 2 years building it. A used yoke and throttle quadrant she'd found online and slowly saved up for, rudder pedals made from modified gaming gear, 3 monitors arranged side by side. The software was professional grade. She'd learned how to configure it from forums, from manuals, from the notes her father had left behind. She put on her headset, loaded the scenario she'd been working on all week, and took the plane up. Tonight's exercise was an engine-out emergency during cruise flight. One engine fails without warning. The scenario forces a sequence of rapid decisions. Identify the failed engine, control the asymmetric thrust, declare emergency with ATC, calculate whether to divert or continue, configure for single-engine approach and landing. She ran it 3 times. The first time, she got the identification right, but lost altitude before she compensated. The second time, she stabilized the aircraft, but mistimed the approach speed and had to go around. The third time, she landed it clean. She pulled off her headset and sat back in her chair. On the corner of the desk, under a small stack of aviation books, there was a photograph. She didn't need to move the books to see it. She'd memorized it. Her father in the left seat of a small training aircraft, door open, sunglasses on, grinning at whoever was holding the camera. He looked happy in the way people look happy when they're exactly where they want to be. "You don't fight the plane," he used to say. "You listen to it." Every system is telling you something. You just have to learn the language. She turned off the monitors and got ready for bed. The trip to Denver had been planned for 3 weeks. It was a weekend visit. 2 nights at a hotel, some meetings Danielle had quietly arranged without explaining fully. When Zariah had asked who they were visiting, Danielle had hesitated a beat too long before saying, "An old colleague of your dad's. Someone who wanted to meet you." That pause had stayed with Zariah. Her father's colleagues were, in her experience, either commercial pilots she'd never met or people who operated in parts of his life he'd kept carefully compartmentalized. She didn't ask follow-up questions. She filed it. The airport was Midland Regional. Not a big terminal. 2 concourses, a handful of gates, a coffee kiosk that Danielle made straight for while Zariah stood near the windows and watched the planes on the tarmac. The aircraft at their gate was a mid-sized narrow body, a regional jet configuration she recognized by the tail shape. She watched the ground crew working around it, the baggage handlers loading the rear, the fuel truck pulling away. Routine pre-departure activity. But she'd heard something earlier when they were waiting in line to check in. 2 crew members, one in a pilot's uniform, one in a maintenance jacket, had been standing near the desk having a conversation they clearly thought was private. She caught fragments. Something about a maintenance check. Something about a delayed log sign-off. Something about it being fine, it's always fine. She'd watched the maintenance worker walk away first, and there had been something in the way he walked, unhurried, unconcerned, that bothered her more than the words themselves. She didn't say anything to Danielle. She stored it. The passenger area filled up steadily. Zariah settled into the window seat. She'd specifically chosen window, as always, and watched the gate area while Danielle got settled beside her and started checking email on her phone. Across the aisle, a man in a charcoal suit was already on a call before the boarding door was even closed. He was the kind of man who filled up the space around him. Broad shoulders, loud voice, the particular confidence of someone who had never been made to feel small. He was telling someone on the phone that the Denver meeting was going to close the deal, that the other side had no leverage left, that he'd be home by Sunday night. His name, Zariah would later hear a flight attendant use, was Mr. Calloway. He had the window seat across the aisle and was already visibly irritated that the boarding process was taking as long as it was. A few rows ahead, a man sat alone in an aisle seat reading a paperback novel. He was in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and the kind of relaxed, efficient way of moving that sometimes belongs to people who've spent a lot of time in professional settings where physical calm is a skill. He was dressed simply, khakis, a collared shirt, a worn jacket. He had a small carry-on that he'd stowed himself without asking for assistance. His name tag on the jacket, which Zariah could just make out from her seat, said something about an aviation maintenance certification. She caught the partial word before he shifted in his seat. 2 rows behind Zariah and Danielle, a man sat by himself in a middle seat, which was unusual. Most people who get assigned middle seats on a short regional flight settle into it with visible resignation, pulling out their phone, putting in earbuds, getting comfortable. This man wasn't doing any of that. He was sitting very still, with his carry-on bag on his lap instead of in the overhead bin, and he was looking at the seat back in front of him with a quality of attention that seemed out of place. Zariah noticed. She noticed the way she noticed most things, without staring, without reacting, without letting her attention become visible. She turned back to the window. Takeoff was smooth. The plane banked left after climbing through the lower cloud layer and leveled out heading northwest, settling into the cruise climb toward altitude. The seatbelt sign stayed on for a few extra minutes past the point where the ride had smoothed out. Standard for many flights, she knew, but her eyes went to the indicator panel near the galley out of habit. She looked out at the left wing. At cruising altitude, a well-functioning aircraft wing has a kind of steadiness to it. A slight flex under load, yes, but a consistent, predictable motion. She'd spent enough hours watching wings, in real life and in simulators, to have a feel for what normal looked like. The wing looked normal. She kept watching it anyway. Something she couldn't name. Not a sound, not a movement, just a feeling that lived somewhere between instinct and pattern recognition. Made her keep watching. After a long moment, she turned away from the window. Danielle was asleep already, head tilted against her travel pillow, phone dark in her lap. Something's not right with this plane. She didn't know yet what it was. She just knew she'd be paying attention. 30 minutes into the flight, everything looked fine. That was the thing about aviation emergencies. The real ones, the ones that came from deep systemic failure rather than sudden mechanical drama. They almost never announced themselves. They built quietly, in small increments, behind panels and inside systems that normal passengers had no reason to think about. Zariah was not a normal passenger. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes moving steadily. Window, overhead panels, the galley area visible at the front of the cabin, the flight attendant moving through the aisle with a drink cart. She wasn't tense. She was listening. Her father had taught her that. Listen before you look. The plane will tell you things your eyes will miss. The engine sound was the first thing she focused on. At cruise altitude, the background hum of the engines should be consistent. A smooth, layered tone that changes slightly during thrust adjustments but maintains a recognizable baseline character. She learned the sound on dozens of flights, reinforced it with hours of simulator audio, sharpened it against recordings her father had kept on an old hard drive she'd found in his things. The right engine sounded right. The left engine, the one under her wing, had something in its rhythm that wasn't quite right. Not a sound exactly, more like a texture. A micro-variation in the tone that came and went on an interval that was too regular to be mechanical vibration and too subtle to be obvious. She kept listening. She counted the interval. Roughly every 45 to 50 seconds, the texture shifted. Very slightly. Barely perceptible unless you were specifically paying attention to that frequency of sound. She looked back out at the left wing. Nothing visible, but she hadn't expected visible. The left engine was forward of the wing. She could see the nacelle from her seat, and it looked normal. Whatever was causing the micro-variation was internal. System level. Pattern from Dad's training notes. System instability, not turbulence, not mechanical damage. Something in the power delivery cycle. She pulled out the small notebook she always carried in her hoodie pocket and wrote a single line. Elling Rhythm Var, 45-50s interval. Not turbulence. 2 rows back, the man with the carry-on on his lap had his eyes open. He wasn't reading. He wasn't on his phone. He was sitting the way Zariah had been sitting, still, attentive, looking at nothing in particular. Except that every few minutes, his gaze moved to the same spot, the forward bulkhead on the left side of the cabin, where a small panel covered what she knew was an equipment access point. He'd look at it for just a second, then look away, then look back. She watched this without appearing to watch it. She'd learned to do that too, peripheral attention, her father had called it. Useful in cockpits because you couldn't stare at every instrument simultaneously. Useful in life for related reasons. The third time the man's eyes went to that panel, he shifted in his seat and moved the carry-on bag from his lap to the floor between his feet. He did it with his right hand. His left hand, she noticed, was resting on the armrest, and his fingers were tapping. Not the idle, rhythmic tapping of someone bored. A different pattern. Too fast. Too irregular. He was nervous about something. For rows ahead, the man in the worn jacket had closed his paperback. He was sitting with his head slightly angled, and Zariah recognized the posture. It was the posture of someone listening to something outside the conversation they appear to be having with themselves. She'd done that posture herself at the STEM Expo. He was paying attention to the aircraft. She was almost certain of it. After a moment, he turned and looked out his window, left side of the aircraft, forward. He had a direct line of sight to the engine nacelle that she didn't. He looked at it for about 10 seconds, expression neutral, and then turned back forward and opened his book again. But he didn't read it. He just held it. The cabin lights flickered. It lasted less than half a second. A brief, full cabin dimming in return that was so fast most passengers probably hadn't registered consciously. The man across the aisle, Mr. Calloway, looked up briefly from his laptop, frowned, looked back down. The woman in front of Zariah touched her overhead light, turned it off and on to check it, then left it on. Routine reactions to what felt like routine, turbulence-adjacent noise. One of the flight attendants, a young woman named Keeley, whose name Zariah had read off her name badge during the drink service, paused in the aisle with her expression momentarily still, then kept moving. Zariah wrote in her notebook, cabin lights, brief full system flicker. 30-minute cruise. No turbulence at time of event. A full cabin power flicker wasn't an engine issue. It was a bus issue, the aircraft's electrical distribution system, which ran off the generators, which ran off the engines. A flicker that brief, absent any turbulence or visible cause, suggested either a loose connection somewhere in the distribution chain or, less commonly, more seriously, a generator irregularity on the primary bus. She thought about the fragment she'd overheard at the gate. Delayed log sign-off. It's always fine. She thought about the interval in the engine sound. She thought about the electrical flicker. She thought, system instability. Not one fault, a pattern. These aren't separate things. Her father's voice, from a training session, so long ago she'd been barely tall enough to see the instrument panel. In aviation, coincidences are rarely coincidences. When two things go wrong at the same time, look for the third thing that explains both of them. She looked toward the front of the cabin. Keely was now at the galley, speaking quietly with the other flight attendant, an older man whose badge read Gerald. Gerald's expression was the practiced neutral of someone who spent a lot of time not alarming passengers. But his eyes, as he listened to Keely, flickered briefly to the cockpit door. Just once. The way your eyes go to the source of a sound you're not sure you heard. Zariah stood up. Excuse me. She stopped beside Keely at the galley. I have a question about the aircraft. Keely turned with the professional warmth that was clearly trained in. Of course, honey. What's on your mind? The cabin lights flickered a few minutes ago, and I've been noticing an irregularity in the left engine sound, a rhythm variation on roughly a 45-second cycle. I think there might be an issue with the electrical bus tied to the left generator. Keely's expression held steady, but something in her eyes shifted, a brief recalibration. She glanced at Gerald, who had turned slightly toward them. That's... Keely chose her words carefully. Honey, the lights flicker sometimes. Air pressure, airflow, it can cause small fluctuations. Nothing to worry about. It wasn't an airflow fluctuation, Zariah said. She kept her voice quiet and level. It was a full cabin event, every light at the same time. That's a bus event, not a localized one. And it aligned with a change in the engine rhythm I've been tracking. Gerald had put down what he was holding. How old are you? 12. But I've been studying aviation for most of my life, and I run a professional-grade flight simulator. I'm not guessing. She paused. I just think someone in the cockpit should know about this. The two flight attendants exchanged a look. It was a brief look, but Zariah was good at reading them. It said, this kid is saying something strange, and I don't know how seriously to take it. I'll mention it to the captain, Keely said. Her tone was the tone of someone who is almost certainly not going to mention it to the captain. Thank you for letting us know. Zariah looked at her for a moment, then nodded and went back to her seat. She was still watching the man in the middle seat when it happened. He'd been still for a while, long enough that she'd wondered if she'd misread him, if the nervous energy had been travel anxiety, nothing more. But now he was standing, holding his carry-on, looking toward the rear of the aircraft. He said something to the passenger next to him, a polite word, the kind you say when you're squeezing past, and moved into the aisle. He walked toward the back of the plane. He passed the lavatories, past the emergency exit row, slowed, slightly, barely, near the rear equipment access panel on the left side of the fuselage. She couldn't see what happened next from her seat, but he was back at the lavatories for barely 60 seconds before he was walking back up the aisle, bag over his shoulder, expression fully composed. Too composed. The composed of someone who'd done something and was now actively performing calm. Zariah wrote in her notebook, SQ passenger, rear panel area, 60s, bag in hand both directions. SQ, suspicious quiet. She'd invented the notation herself. The aircraft pitched. Not violently. Not the sharp lurch of severe turbulence. It was a softer, stranger movement, a sudden differential, like one wing had momentarily lost a fraction of its lift relative to the other. The plane recovered within 2 or 3 seconds. Most passengers registered it as light chop and went back to their screens. But the recovery hadn't felt clean. It had felt corrected, as if the autopilot had caught something and compensated, which was exactly what autopilot was designed to do, except that the correction had been slightly heavy, slightly overtuned for the magnitude of the deviation. Zariah knew what that felt like. She'd induced similar oscillations in her simulator to test autopilot response behavior. The overcorrection pattern was characteristic of autopilot working harder than it should, fighting a trend rather than managing stable flight. The left engine tone, the electrical flicker, the altitude fluctuation. She felt it then, the shape of it assembling in her mind the way a picture assembled on a screen as the resolution loaded, pixel by pixel, until suddenly there was something recognizable. This isn't random. These are symptoms of the same underlying failure. She looked at the man in the middle seat. He was back in his seat now, bag between his feet again, left hand on the armrest. His fingers had stopped tapping. She thought about that. The anxiety before the trip to the back. The calm after it. Something had changed for him when he went back there. She put her pen down and looked out at the left wing for a long moment. Then she wrote the last line in her notebook for this flight, underlining it once. This isn't an accident. Something's failing, or being forced to fail. She closed the notebook and held it in both hands and looked toward the front of the plane, where the cockpit door was closed and locked, and thought about what came next. The first alarm didn't build up to anything. It just arrived. 1 second the cabin was ordinary. Mr. Calloway typing on his laptop, the woman in 14C watching something on her tablet, A baby 3 rose back, making the soft, exploratory sound babies make when they're not yet unhappy, but getting there. The next second, a sharp, repeating tone cut through all of it from somewhere forward, and the aircraft shuddered in a way that had nothing to do with turbulence. It was a full-body shudder, the kind that came from something changing in the power plant, not from air moving the wrong way outside the fuselage. Zariah felt it through the seat frame, through the armrests, through the soles of her shoes on the cabin floor. She'd felt it once before in her simulator, a dual-system fault scenario her father had programmed himself, labeled in his handwriting on a sticky note on the monitor. What happens when two things fail at the same time? She was already sitting forward in her seat when the oxygen masks dropped. They came down in a single, synchronized motion from every overhead panel at once. The yellow cups swinging on their plastic tubes, the small bags not yet inflating, waiting for the passenger to pull the tube before they'd fill. The cabin filled immediately with a particular kind of sound that has no good name. Not screaming, not yet, but the collective sharp intake of breath from 140 people who understood simultaneously that something was very wrong. Danielle grabbed Zariah's arm. "Put yours on," Zariah said. Her voice was steady. She reached up and pulled her own mask down, pulled the tube, once to inflate the bag, and pressed it to her face. "Pull the tube. Like this." Danielle's hands were shaking, but she did it. The plane had nose forward. Not sharply, not the steep dive of a plane that had lost all control, but a definite sustained downward attitude, the kind that pressed you into your seat at a slightly wrong angle, the kind that said the aircraft was descending faster than it was supposed to, and no one had told it to stop. The alarm was still going. Two tones, alternating. Zariah identified it before she'd consciously decided to. Master warning. Not a single system. Multiple systems flagging simultaneously. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. Remain calm." Keely's voice over the intercom cut in and then cut out. The PA made a sharp hissing sound and went dead. Gerald had already moved to the cockpit door. Zariah could see him from her seat. He was pressing the call button on the panel beside the door once, twice, 3 times. He had his phone to his ear. His face was professionally controlled, but his body was doing things his face wasn't. His weight shifting forward, his free hand pressed flat against the door like he was trying to feel something through it. No response from inside. He pressed the code on the keypad. The door's lock light didn't change. He pressed it again, different sequence. Still nothing. What's happening? Mr. Calloway was standing in the aisle 2 rows up, oxygen mask hanging around his neck and used. "Why isn't anyone flying this plane? Someone tell me what's happening." "Sir, please sit down and put on your mask." Keely was moving through the aisle, her own mask on, both hands out. "I want to know who's in that cockpit right now." "Sir." The plane lurched. Not a shudder this time. A real movement, sudden drop of what felt like 200 feet that compressed everyone into their seats and then released them just as fast, and the sound level in the cabin jumped instantly from frightened murmuring to real, full-throated panic. The baby 3 rose back, started screaming, and didn't stop. Someone behind Zariah was saying, "Oh God, oh God, oh God," in a rhythm that wasn't prayer, just terror finding its voice. Danielle's grip on Zariah's arm tightened to the point of pain. Gerald got the cockpit door open. Zariah saw it from her angle. The door swinging inward, Gerald stepping through, then the quality of his stillness as he stood in the threshold. It was a 1-second stillness that said everything. He looked inside and seen something that had turned him to stone. He turned back into the cabin. His eyes went immediately to Keely. He made a gesture, small, deliberate, that said, "Get up here. Now." Keely moved past Zariah without looking at her. Zariah unclipped her seatbelt. "What are you doing?" Danielle grabbed for her again. "I need to see." She stood. "Zariah, sit down." "Aunt Danielle." She looked at her aunt directly. "I need to see what's happening. Please don't stop me." Danielle looked at her face. Whatever she saw there, the stillness in it, the focus, made her let go. Just for a second. Just enough. Zariah moved up the aisle. The cockpit door was still open. Gerald was just inside, and Keely had pushed past him. Zariah reached the threshold and looked in. The captain was in the left seat, slumped forward against the yoke. Not unconscious in the way of sleep, slumped in a heavy, wrong way, his full weight pressing against the control column, which was part of why the nose was down. The first officer was back in his seat, head tilted, face slack, both hands fallen away from the side stick. His right arm had slid down to hang at his side. The instrument panel was a landscape of warnings. Red flags across multiple systems. The altitude was unwinding. They were descending through 19,000 feet, and the rate was not small. Keely was pulling the captain back from the yoke with both hands, try to get his weight off the control column. She managed it. The nose attitude improved fractionally, but the moment she let go to reach for the radio, he slumped forward again. "Hold him back," Gerald said, taking Keeley's place. "Both hands. Don't let go." He reached for the radio himself. "Mayday, mayday, mayday." His voice was train steady, the words coming out in the correct sequence. "This is flight." The radio crackled. Static. A voice breaking through in fragments. The plane's descent hadn't stopped. The man from the worn jacket, the engineer, had come up the aisle behind Zariah without her hearing him. She sensed him before she saw him, and when she turned, he was right there, looking past her into the cockpit with the expression of someone doing rapid calculations. "Both of them," he said. Not to her. To the situation. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "You know aircraft systems?" "Yes." He didn't waste time asking follow-up questions. He stepped to the cockpit door. "I'm an off-duty maintenance engineer. Let me in. I can help." Gerald looked over his shoulder. His face said he was out of options. "Get in." The engineer stepped over the threshold and went immediately to the instrument panel, scanning. His hands moved across the controls with the economy of someone who'd spent decades knowing exactly where things were. He found the autopilot disconnect, looked at its status, looked at the altitude, looked at the vertical speed indicator. "Autopilot's fighting a trim fault," he said. "Captain's weight on the yoke made it worse. Now it's trying to correct for a false input." He reached for the trim wheel. The plane responded, nose coming up slightly, descent rate decreasing. But the moment he tried to hold the correction, something in the system pushed back. The trim wheel resisted. He turned it again, harder. The aircraft steadied for 4 seconds, and then the nose dropped again, more sharply this time, and the master warning tone changed pitch. A new alarm joined it. Zariah identified it before either Gerald or the engineer said anything. "That's engine 2, she said. The engineer's head came up. He looked at the N2 gauge for the left engine. It was unwinding. "I can't hold both," he said. He wasn't speaking to anyone specific. He was speaking to the problem. "I can't manage the trim fault and a failing engine from this seat without a pilot's input. I don't have the control authority from here." He turned to Gerald. "Is there a deadheading pilot on the manifest?" "No." "Any passenger with flying experience?" A 2-second silence. Zariah stepped through the cockpit door. Nobody moved for a moment. The alarms were still going. The altitude was still unwinding. The aircraft was doing what an aircraft without proper management does. It was slowly, persistently trying to depart from controlled flight, and the only thing standing between organized descent and something much worse was a partially functioning autopilot and one engineer who'd already said he couldn't hold it alone. The plane didn't care that the person stepping forward was 12 years old. Zariah stepped up to the right seat, the first officer's seat, and looked at the panel. Her eyes went across it in the pattern she'd trained. Attitude indicator, airspeed, altimeter, vertical speed, engine instruments, electrical panel, fuel state. 6 seconds of scanning, the way her father had drilled it. Not reading individual numbers yet, just taking the picture. The picture was bad, but it was not unrecoverable. "Not yet. Get him out of the seat," she said. She meant the first officer. Her voice came out flat and functional. "He's too close to the controls." Gerald and the engineer looked at each other. "She's a child," Gerald started. "I know what I'm doing." She didn't say it loudly. She said it the way she said things when she needed them to land cleanly. "I know this aircraft system. I've run this simulation. Right now the autopilot is trying to correct for the trim fault, and it's using the wrong reference because the captain's weight created a false input. I need to disengage autopilot, manually correct the trim, and then re-establish a stable attitude. I can do this, but I need 30 seconds and I need him out of this seat." From the cabin doorway, Danielle's voice, "Zariah. Aunt Danielle." She didn't look back. "I need you to go back and keep the passengers calm. Right now, that's the most important thing you can do. Can you do that?" A pause. Then, from the doorway, Mr. Calloway's voice, "You're seriously going to let a kid?" "Sir." Danielle's voice, cutting across his, harder than Zariah had ever heard it. "If you have a pilot's license, now would be the time to say so. Otherwise, step back." Silence from Calloway. "Move him," Danielle said, and she looked at Gerald with an expression that settled the question. The engineer helped Gerald shift the first officer back in the seat, arms clear of the controls. The man was breathing. Both pilots were breathing, but neither was responsive. Whatever had taken him down had done it fast. Zariah sat in the right seat. She pulled the lap belt across and secured it with the automatic motion of someone who'd done it 1,000 times in practice and was now doing it for real. She put both hands on the side stick, the right seat control input on this aircraft type, and felt the resistance in it. The autopilot was still active, and it was not happy. Give me the autopilot disconnect, she said to the engineer. You sure? If I disengage it manually, I'll be taking on a compromised trim state. That's fine. I know what it'll feel like. What I can't do is fight the autopilot and the trim fault at the same time. I need it off. He reached to the panel. Disengaging. The moment the autopilot dropped off, she felt it. The aircraft's true state coming through the side stick like a conversation. The nose wanted to drop. The left wing wanted to fall. The trim was set slightly nose down from the captain's weight episode, and the system hadn't corrected it yet. It wasn't violent. It was insistent. It was a plane that wanted to go somewhere she didn't want it to go, and her job was to talk it out of it. She applied back pressure, steady, controlled, not fighting. Her left hand found the trim well on instinct, and she rolled it, feeling for the neutral point, watching the attitude indicator. The nose came up. The left wing lifted. The vertical speed indicator slowed in its downward movement, steadied, reversed. The aircraft leveled. Not perfectly. There was still a slight left bank tendency, and the left engine instruments were not reading well. But the uncontrolled descent had stopped. The master warning tone dropped from its highest register to a lower, steadier one. Still alarming, but the difference between everything is wrong and some things are wrong. In the cabin, she heard the change in the ambient sound. The shift from sustained panic to something less certain of itself. The screaming had stopped. The crying hadn't, but crying was manageable. Crying meant people were still capable of feeling something other than pure terror. The engineer was staring at the instruments. Then at her. You stopped the descent, he said. Temporarily. She didn't take her eyes off the attitude indicator. The left engine is degrading. I have a fuel imbalance building. Left tank is feeding unevenly. And I don't know the trim fault source yet, which means if it gets worse, I'll feel it get worse. She paused. I need radio contact with ATC. Who has the radio? Gerald had the radio. He handed it across. Static. She keyed the mic. Any ATC, any frequency, this is, she stopped. She didn't know the flight number. She looked at the instrument panel, found a transponder, read the squawk code. Any ATC, squawk 7702, we have a pilot incapacitation emergency. Both flight crew down, aircraft is under control. I need a center frequency and a priority handling. She released the mic, waited. Static. Then a voice, male, professional, slightly sharp with urgency. Aircraft squawking 7702. Say again your situation. Over. Both pilots are incapacitated. Unconscious. I have the aircraft. We are level at, she checked, 16,400 feet, maintaining approximately, heading 270. Left engine degrading. I need vectors to nearest suitable airport, and I need medical information on pilot incapacitation causes. Over. A longer pause this time. The engineer was watching her. She could feel it without looking. The radio came back. 7702, confirm. Who is flying the aircraft right now? She'd expected the question. She'd half expected to have to fight it. My name is Zariah Washington. I'm 12 years old, and I'm in the first officer's seat. I have approximately 400 hours on a professional-grade flight simulator for this aircraft type, and I have successfully stabilized the aircraft from an uncontrolled descent. I need vectors, and I need them now. Over. The pause this time was shorter. Something had changed in the quality of the silence. A recalibration on the other end. 7702, understand you're 12 years old, flying from the right seat. Can you confirm current aircraft state? Are you in controlled flight? Affirmative. Aircraft is level. Airspeed is, she checked, 280 knots, slight left bank tendency, I'm correcting manually. Left engine N2 is degrading, currently at 82% and dropping. I have a fuel imbalance. I do not yet have a source for the trim fault. Over. Another pause. Then a different voice, older, steadier, someone who'd clearly been brought to the mic with intention. 7702. This is Senior Controller David Reeves. I'm on with you now. Good job stabilizing that aircraft. I'm assigning you priority handling. Give me a moment to get your options together. Stay on this frequency. Over. Copy that, Zariah said. I'm not going anywhere. Behind her, in the cabin doorway, she heard a sound that might have been a short, disbelieving laugh from someone, or might have been a sob. She didn't look back to find out which. The engineer, his name was Warren, she'd finally heard someone use it, had moved to the left seat, and was managing what he could reach from there. Electrical panel switches, keeping watch on the engine instruments, calling out numbers she asked for. He was good at it. He was trained for exactly this kind of mechanical assessment, even if flying an aircraft wasn't his discipline. Left engine is at 78, he said. Still dropping, but slower now. The fuel cross-feed valve, she said. Left side. Can you see its position? He looked. Closed. Open it. Slowly. He did. She felt the aircraft respond. The left engine's fuel supply stabilizing as the crossfeed equalized the imbalance. The N2 gauge stopped its descent, held at 76%. Not good, but not worsening. Okay, she said quietly, more to herself than to Warren. She was doing the math in her head, the same calculations she'd run in simulator emergencies dozens of times, except this time the numbers had weight behind them. Okay, you've done this before, Warren said. It wasn't quite a question. In simulation, she adjusted her heading correction slightly, watching the artificial horizon. But my dad always said simulation was 90% of reality. The other 10% is what you're made of. Warren was quiet for a moment. Your dad sounds like he knew what he was talking about. She didn't answer that. Controller Reeves came back on. 7702, I have your situation. Nearest suitable airport is Caldwell Regional, approximately 80 miles at your current position and heading. I can vector you for a straight-in approach. However, I need you to understand, we're working on getting emergency services to the airport, but at your current descent rate and engine state, you're going to need to manage your speed carefully on approach. Are you familiar with the ILS approach procedure? Over. Affirmative, she said, but I want to flag something first. My engine state isn't from normal mechanical failure. I believe this aircraft was deliberately sabotaged. I have a passenger on board I've been tracking since before takeoff, who made contact with a rear equipment panel approximately 40 minutes ago. The failure pattern I'm managing is layered and timed. This wasn't a maintenance failure. Over. She could feel Warren's eyes on her. She kept her own eyes on the instruments. The controller's pause was longer this time. 7702, copy that. I'm logging that information and flagging it for the appropriate authorities. Right now, my priority is getting you and those passengers on the ground safely. We can deal with the rest after. Agreed, she said. But I need someone to make sure that passenger doesn't have access to any more aircraft systems. Over. Understood. Can the cabin crew handle that? She looked over her shoulder. Gerald was in the doorway. Gerald, the man who was sitting in the middle, 2 rows behind us. Don't let him near any panel or equipment access. Keep someone with him. Now. Gerald nodded and disappeared into the cabin. She looked back at the instruments. The fuel imbalance had stabilized, but not resolved. The left engine was holding at 76%. The trim fault was still present, a persistent, low-level nagging in the side stick that she was compensating for with steady back pressure. It was manageable, but it was tiring in a way she hadn't anticipated. Real aircraft controls had feedback that simulators approximated but couldn't fully replicate. Her forearms were already feeling it. She adjusted her grip, kept the nose where she needed it. Warren, she said. Yeah. The trim fault. I need to find the source. What systems could create a nose-down trim bias on this type? He was quiet for a moment, thinking, stabilizer trim, actuator fault. Or, less commonly, a pitch computer input error. He looked at the overhead panel. Or something physical. Something that's been introduced into the system. He said the last part carefully. They both knew what he meant. She thought about the man in the middle seat. The rear panel. The 60 seconds. Check the pitch trim circuit breakers, she said. All of them. Tell me if anything looks pulled or modified. He started checking. She held the aircraft level and thought about what she knew and what she was starting to understand about why this plane was the one that had been chosen, and why this flight specifically, and what it had to do with a man in Denver who'd wanted to meet the daughter of Marcus Washington. 2 circuit breakers, Warren said quietly. Pitch trim monitoring circuit. Both pull. She absorbed that. Someone knew exactly what they were pulling, she said. Yes, Warren said. She looked at the attitude indicator. 16,000 feet, stable, heading west-southwest toward a runway she hadn't seen yet and couldn't visualize beyond what the charts in her memory told her. 140 people behind her. 2 pilots who couldn't help her. An engineer who was doing everything he could from the wrong seat. And somewhere in the back of the aircraft, a man who had done this on purpose and was now sitting quietly in his seat, waiting to see what happened. This plane isn't just failing, she said. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just clearly, the way you state a thing when you want the record to be accurate. Someone did this. Warren looked at her. She keyed the mic. Reeves, 7702. Ready for those vectors. Let's get this done. Controller Reeves had been working air traffic for 19 years, and in that time he had handled 2 declared emergencies, 1 mid-air communication failure, and 1 aircraft that had come in with a landing gear malfunction that had kept him awake for 3 nights afterward. He had never, in 19 years, had a conversation like this one. He kept his voice even. That was the job. 7702. Turning you left heading 240. Caldwell Regional is at your 11 o'clock, 81 miles. Winds at destination are 180 at 12. Slight gusts reported. Emergency services are being staged. Over. Copy, 240. The girl's voice on the radio was the strangest thing he'd encountered in a career full of strange things. Not because it was young, but because of what it wasn't. It wasn't shaking. It wasn't performing calm the way untrained people did when they were trying to sound calm and failing. It was just steady. The kind of steady that came from somewhere genuine. Zariah. I'm gonna call you Zariah. That okay? That's fine. I want a full picture from you. Walk me through what you're managing right now, top to bottom. She took a breath. He heard it. And then she did exactly what he'd asked. She ran through it like a checklist. Autopilot disengaged, manual control from right seat. Left engine at 76% N2. Holding, but not recovering. Fuel cross-feed open. Imbalance stabilized, but not resolved. Pitch trim fault active. 2 monitoring circuit breakers confirmed pulled. Navigation drift slight. She was correcting with heading input. Hydraulic pressure normal for now. He was writing as she talked. The supervisor behind him had stopped pretending to do other things and was reading over his shoulder. That's a thorough picture, Reeves said. I've been tracking this aircraft's behavior since before takeoff, she said. I had 40 minutes of data before the emergency triggered. The failures aren't random. They're layered in a way that suggests someone who understood exactly which systems to compromise for maximum effect with minimum immediate visibility. His supervisor put a hand on his shoulder and said quietly, "Get her everything she needs." Reeves got back on the mic, understood. "I'm with you all the way to the ground. What do you need from me right now? I need to know about the terrain between my current position and Caldwell. Any high ground I should know about on this heading." He pulled the chart. "You're clear on 240. No significant terrain above 4,000 feet within your corridor. You have room." "Good," she said. And then, after a brief pause, "Thank you, Mr. Reeves." He didn't have an answer for that. He just stayed on frequency. At 14,000 feet, the storm found them. It hadn't been on the forecast when the flight departed. A fast-moving cell that had developed and tracked north faster than the models predicted, the kind of weather that reminded everyone in aviation that the atmosphere did not read weather reports. The turbulence came first, light, and then moderate, rattling the cabin and pushing the aircraft left and right of heading and movements that Zariah had to correct for continuously. Then the radio began breaking up. 7702, say again your static altitude, over. 14,000, say again, you're broken. Copy 14, static, maintain, we're losing you, standby. And then Reeves was gone. Static wall, full frequency, nothing coming through. She looked at the navigation display. She had her position. She had her heading. She had the chart information Reeves had given her before the interference, and she had the training in her head that her father had put there across hundreds of hours of instruction, most of which she'd absorbed so completely that it no longer felt like something she'd learned. It just felt like something she knew. She could fly without the radio. She'd done it in simulation. Communications failure scenarios were standard emergency training. You maintained the last assigned heading, squawked 7600 on the transponder to indicate radio failure, kept flying toward the destination. ATC would know what the squawk meant. They'd expect her. She reached up and set the transponder. "Storm interference," she said to Warren. "I've lost radio contact. I'm setting 7600. We maintain 240 and keep our altitude profile. Reeves knows where we are." Warren was watching the engine instruments. Left engine just dropped to 71. She absorbed that. 71% N2 was still within the range where the engine was producing useful thrust, but the trend line wasn't good. If it kept declining at the current rate, she was looking at possible flame-out in. She ran the mental calculation, somewhere between 30 and 50 minutes, depending on what was driving the degradation. "Is it a fuel issue or an internal fault?" she asked. "Hard to say from here. Fuel flow looks slightly low for the thrust setting." He leaned forward. "Could be a fuel control unit issue. Someone might have introduced a restriction. Another deliberate failure. Time to come online slowly, invisibly, during flight." "Okay," she said. She adjusted the thrust on the left engine down slightly. Counterintuitive, but reducing demand on a struggling power plant sometimes extended its life. "I'm reducing left engine thrust. We'll lean on the right engine more. It'll create a yaw tendency. I'll need to stay on the rudder." "You sure?" "I'm sure." She pressed her right foot against the rudder pedal, feeling for the balance point. The aircraft straightened. "See?" Warren let out a slow breath. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I see." In the cabin, it had been 4 minutes since the oxygen mask had dropped and the world had rearranged itself. The masks had stopped being necessary. They were at a pressure altitude where the cabin was managing, but most passengers were still wearing them, gripping the armrests, watching the flight attendants for information. Danielle had moved to the center of the cabin. She didn't have a script for this. She'd spent her adult life in medical billing administration. She was good with spreadsheets, good with people in a professional context, good at untangling complicated insurance claims. Nothing about that had prepared her for this. But she was Marcus Washington's sister, and Marcus Washington had been the kind of person who walked into difficult situations and made other people feel less afraid simply by being present. And somewhere underneath the terror she was managing from the inside, she found that quality in herself and held on to it. "I need everyone to listen to me," she said. Her voice carried. "The aircraft is under control. I know that's hard to believe right now, and I know you're frightened. I'm frightened too. But the person at the controls knows what she's doing. I have watched her fly this aircraft away from a situation that none of the adults in that cockpit could handle, and I'm telling you, we are going to land." From the back, a man's voice. "Who is she? Who's flying?" "Her name is Zariah Washington. She's 12 years old. She has been studying aviation and flight systems her entire life. And right now, she's the most qualified person on this aircraft to do what she's doing. What I need from every single one of you is to stay in your seats, keep your belts fastened, and let her work." A silence. Then Mr. Calloway, from his aisle seat, his voice stripped of its earlier authority. "She really know what she's doing?" Danielle looked at him. "She stopped the plane from crashing," she said simply. "What do you think?" Calloway looked down at his hands. Said nothing. Back in the cockpit, Zariah was working the fuel imbalance. With the crossfeed valve open, she'd been slowly correcting the difference between the left and right tanks. But the process was sluggish. Whoever had introduced the restriction in the left fuel control unit had effectively slowed the left tank's consumption rate, which meant fuel was pooling on the left side while the right burned down faster. Left uncorrected, the weight asymmetry would worsen her roll tendency and add to the structural stress on the airframe. She'd been managing it in increments. Adjust. Wait. Check. Adjust again. Warren was watching the circuit breaker panel when he said, "There's something else." She didn't look away from the attitude indicator. "Tell me." "The rear equipment panel, the one near row 22. Your passenger went back there, you said." 60 seconds. The avionics cooling duct runs behind that panel. If someone introduced an obstruction, something as simple as a wadded material blocking partial airflow, it would cause a slow thermal buildup in the avionics bay. He paused. It wouldn't show immediately, but over a 2-hour flight, at altitude, with the system working hard, it would start to affect the systems it cools, she said. Autopilot computers. Flight management. Navigation. Yes. She thought about the micro variations she'd noticed in the engine sound in Act 2. The electrical flicker. The altitude fluctuation that the autopilot had overcorrected for. All of it sitting downstream of a thermal issue in the avionics bay that was building quietly, invisibly, degree by degree. The circuit breakers confirm intentional electrical interference, she said. The fuel control restriction confirms fuel system tampering. And now a possible avionics cooling obstruction. 3 separate system categories. She kept her voice level. Whoever did this knew the aircraft. They knew which systems were independent enough that each failure would look like a coincidence. Warren was quiet for a moment. This wasn't someone who read a manual, he said. This was someone with maintenance access history. She nodded slowly. She was beginning to understand the shape of it. Not all of it. Not yet. But the shape. "We have a warning," Warren said sharply. She looked up. The hydraulic pressure gauge was ticking down, slowly but moving. Not another tampering. This one was probably genuine cascade. The thermal buildup in the avionics bay affecting the hydraulic system controller. One deliberate fault creating conditions for a second fault that hadn't even been planned. "How much do I have?" she asked. "Pressure is at 2,800. Normal is 3,000. It's dropping slowly." She did the math. At the current rate, she had enough hydraulic pressure for the approach and landing. Maybe, if nothing else degraded, and if she managed the control inputs carefully, minimizing hydraulic demand, using trim rather than control surface deflection wherever possible, conserving what she had. "I can work with that," she said. "But I need to land this aircraft before that pressure gets below 2,000. After that, I start losing control authority I can't recover." "How far out are we?" She checked the navigation display. 62 miles. The radio crackled, static resolving into fragments, then into something clearer. 702, do you copy? Over. Reeves. She keyed the mic. 7702, I copy. You're broken but readable. I set 7,600. during interference. Current state. Left engine at 69%. Hydraulic pressure beginning slow decline. I estimate adequate for landing if I can maintain current rate. I need to know my distance, and I need to know that runway is ready. Over. Reeves's voice, steadier now that the storm cell had moved slightly. Copy all. You're 60 miles out. Runway is prepared. Emergency services staged. Foam trucks on standby. I need your fuel state. Over. Fuel is adequate. The imbalance is still present, but manageable. I'm not declaring a fuel emergency. She glanced at Warren, who nodded confirmation. Over. Understood. Zariah, I need to tell you something. A pause. Caldwell Regional. The runway is 5,800 feet. For a regional jet in normal configuration, that's workable. In your configuration, with the hydraulic issue, it's tight. I need you to be prepared for that. She'd already known it would be tight. She'd done the math twice. Copy, she said. I'm prepared. Gerald had done what Zariah asked. He'd moved through the cabin quietly, professional, the way you move when you don't want to alarm people more than they already are. He positioned himself 2 rows ahead of the man in the middle seat, the one whose name was on the manifest as Mr. Derek Hollins, and he'd asked Keeley to take the aisle seat directly beside him under the pretense of a passenger welfare check. Hollins hadn't reacted. He'd accepted the presence of the flight attendant beside him with a particular non-reaction of someone who had anticipated exactly this and had already decided what it meant for his plan. His plan, as best he could tell, was still on track. The aircraft was supposed to be in an uncontrolled descent by now. The fact that it wasn't, the fact that the PA had carried a child's voice saying words like fuel, crossfeed, and trim fault, had introduced a variable he hadn't anticipated, and he was working through what that meant. He looked calm. His hands were in his lap. He was watching the seat back. But Danielle had moved to the row behind him after her address to the cabin, and she had been watching him for 6 minutes, and what she saw was a man performing stillness rather than experiencing it. The difference was in the small things, the way his jaw worked occasionally without producing sound, the way his eyes didn't move the way eyes moved in genuine shock or fear, the way his hands were in his lap rather than gripping the armrest the way almost every other passenger was. Gerald, she said quietly. She leaned forward. Gerald turned. He hasn't reacted to anything, she said. Not the masks, not the announcement, nothing. He's not scared. Gerald looked at Hollins. Look back at Danielle. What do you want to do? I want to know who he is. Keeley had his boarding pass information from the manifest. Derek Hollins, ticketed through a corporate account. Listed employer, a consulting firm with a name that meant nothing. Meridian Advisory Group. But the detail that snagged was the seat assignment. He'd been ticketed to a window seat in row 8. He'd asked the gate agent to change to the middle seat in row 24. Row 24. Right seat. Left side. The rear equipment panel was at row 22. Left side of the fuselage. Danielle showed the seat change information to Gerald on the printed manifest copy Keeley had pulled from the galley storage. Gerald looked at it for a moment. He moved himself to within 2 rows of the panel, Gerald said. And he had his bag on his lap for the first 40 minutes of the flight, Danielle said. My niece noted that before the crisis started. She folded the manifest. Someone needs to ask him some questions. Gerald straightened. He was not a confrontational person by nature. 19 years of cabin service had trained him toward de-escalation, toward smoothing things over, toward keeping everyone comfortable. But the aircraft he was responsible for had been deliberately targeted. The pilots were unconscious, and a 12-year-old was keeping them alive from the right seat of the cockpit. He walked to row 24 and crouched down beside Hollins' seat. Mr. Hollins, he said, quietly, I'd like to ask you a few questions. Hollins looked at him. His expression was exactly calibrated. Just the right amount of concern, just the right amount of cooperative passenger energy. Of course. Terrible situation. Is there anything I can do to help? You change your seat at the gate, Gerald said. From 8A to 24B. More legroom in the back, Hollins said. I have an E issue. 24B is a middle seat. A fraction of a pause. So small that most people would have missed it. Force of habit. I always sit on the left side. The equipment panel behind your seat, Gerald said. Did you open it during the flight? I don't know what you're talking about. You walked to the back of the aircraft approximately 45 minutes into the flight. You were gone for about 60 seconds. I went to the lavatory. The lavatory was occupied, Keeley said from the adjacent seat. She'd been quietly checking. I was near the rear galley. Both lavatories in the rear were in use for most of that window. Hollins looked at her. Something shifted in his eyes, not quite dropping the mask, but re-evaluating the situation. Recalculating. I don't think this conversation is appropriate, he said. I'm a passenger. You're a passenger on an aircraft that's been deliberately sabotaged. Danielle said from behind him. Her voice was calm in a way that had gone past fear and come out the other side. And you're the only person on this flight who doesn't seem bothered by that. Hollins turned to look at her, and for just a moment, the calculation in his eyes was visible. Gerald, Danielle said, I'd like him moved to the bulkhead row where someone can watch him properly. And I'd like his bag checked. The bag. Keeley pulled it from under his seat. He didn't resist, which was interesting, which said he'd already removed anything incriminating, and went through it methodically. Clothes. A laptop. A phone with a cracked screen. A slim folder of papers. The papers were what mattered. They were aviation technical documents. Maintenance procedure excerpts specific to this aircraft type. 3 pages had annotations in the margins. Handwritten, small, precise. System schematics with specific components circled. The pitch trim monitoring circuit. The left engine fuel control unit. The avionics cooling duct access point. Not one component. All 3. Keeley brought them to Danielle with slightly unsteady hands. Danielle looked at them for a long moment. Then she said, I need to get these to Zariah. She pushed through to the cockpit quietly, tapped Warren on the shoulder, and passed the documents through. Warren spread them on his knee and looked at them, and the color of his expression changed in a way that said he recognized the level of knowledge they represented. Zariah, he said. She was managing a slight heading correction, eyes on the instruments. What? Look at this when you have a second. I don't have a second. Tell me what's on it. He described the documents. The 3 circle components. The handwritten annotations. She was quiet for a moment, hands steady on the side stick. The circle components, she said. Are the annotations targeting those components specifically for the failure modes we've been experiencing? Yes, precisely. So whoever wrote those annotations knew in advance exactly how this aircraft would fail. Yes. She held the heading. The left engine was at 67% now. The hydraulic pressure was at 2,700. Warren, she said. The company named on those documents. Is there a company name? He looked. One of the pages had a letterhead, partially visible. Meridian, something. Meridian Advisory, maybe. She absorbed that. Filed it. That name, she said quietly. My aunt and I are going to Denver to meet someone who worked with my father. The meeting was arranged through a company. I only caught part of the name when Aunt Danielle was on the phone last week. She paused. I think it was Meridian something. Warren looked at her. She kept flying. Danielle had come back to the cockpit doorway, and she'd heard the last part of that exchange. She stood very still with one hand on the doorframe. Zariah, she said. Not right now, Aunt Danielle. Your father. I know. Her voice didn't change pitch. Didn't crack. I know something happened that connects to this. I know that's why we're going to Denver. I've known for a while that Dad's accident might not have been an accident. She adjusted the heading by 2 degrees. I need to land this plane before I can think about the rest of it. Danielle pressed her lips together hard. Her eyes were wet. Okay, she said. Okay, baby. Is the passenger secured? Gerald has him at the bulkhead. Keeley is watching him. Good. Danielle started to step back, then stopped. He's been asking about you. The passenger. Hollins. What's he asking? He wanted to know who was flying. When Gerald told him, when he heard your name, his expression changed. She paused. He looked like he recognized it. Zariah didn't respond for a moment. Then she keyed the cabin PA, a short, controlled burst. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Zariah. We are approximately 50 miles from our emergency landing site. I'm going to need complete quiet in the cabin for the next 30 minutes. That means seated, belted, and still. Your cooperation is the most important thing you can give me right now. She released the PA. In the cabin, the murmuring stopped. Gerald had made the mistake of letting Hollins see that the aircraft was still under control, still flying, still on course. The mistake was in not anticipating what that knowledge would do to a man whose plan was unraveling. Hollins was calm when he spoke, unhurried, like someone delivering information they'd been holding back for effect. You know what's funny? He said to Gerald, who was standing in the aisle beside him. I knew her father. Gerald looked at him. Marcus Washington. Hollins said the name plainly, the way you say the name of someone you don't feel anything complicated about. Good pilot. Better investigator, as it turned out. He spent 2 years documenting what certain people had been doing to maintenance records in the regional carrier networks. Falsifying service logs. Clearing aircraft for service that hadn't been properly cleared. The kind of thing that saves companies money and costs passengers their lives. Eventually, he adjusted in his seat. He was about to take his documentation to the FAA. He had a meeting scheduled. Gerald said nothing. He never made it to that meeting, Hollins said. His car went off a highway outside of Tulsa. Ice on the road, they said. He tilted his head slightly. There wasn't any ice reported that night on that stretch of road. Gerald's hands were at his sides. Who are you? Someone was asked to make sure the story didn't get a second chapter. He glanced toward the cockpit door. I didn't know about the girl. That was an oversight on someone's part. She wasn't supposed to be here. She wasn't supposed to be involved. A pause. She has his eyes, you know. Same stillness. Gerald moved then. He turned to Keeley and made a short, decisive gesture, and the two of them repositioned Hollins, hands behind the seatbelt, makeshift restraint from zip tie, cable ties from the emergency kit. No ceremony. Hollins didn't resist. He sat in his new configuration with the same composure, like a man who had accepted the shape of how this was going to end. It doesn't matter, he said, as Gerald stepped away. Stopping me doesn't stop anything. This is bigger than one flight. Gerald walked back up the aisle without responding. Warren had relayed enough of the cabin situation to Zariah that she had the picture now. Most of it, anyway. The parts she'd suspected and the parts she hadn't. Her father hadn't slipped on an icy road. She held that knowledge in her chest, where it sat with a weight she recognized. Not new weight. Exactly, because she carried suspicion of it for a long time, in the way children carry things they can feel but can't name. It was the same weight that had made her stare at the ceiling at night when she was 10 and they'd told her about the accident. The same weight that had made her go deeper into the flight manuals, deeper into the simulator, deeper into everything her father had left behind, as if there was an answer in there she hadn't found yet. There was an answer. She was 48 miles from landing with it. Reeves, she keyed the mic 7702. I have updated information on the sabotage. The passenger we've restrained has verbally connected himself to the deliberate incapacitation of the flight crew and provided contextual information suggesting this action was part of an organized operation targeting aviation maintenance record integrity. The same operation is believed responsible for the death of my father, Marcus Washington, approximately 2 years ago. Over. A long pause on the frequency. Then Reeves, copy all, Zariah. FBI have been notified and are coordinating with law enforcement at Caldwell Regional. The information you're providing is being recorded and logged. Over. Thank you. She checked the instruments. Left engine 65%. Hydraulic pressure 2600. 48 miles. The second engine warning light came on. Not a full alarm, not a flame-out indicator, but a performance degradation flag on the right engine. Not sabotage, genuine cascade. The asymmetric thrust load she'd been placing on the right engine for the past 30 minutes was beginning to show. Warren, she said. I see it. She looked at the navigation display. 48 miles. At their current airspeed, that was roughly 14 minutes. We're not making it to Caldwell in this configuration, she said. Warren looked at the chart. There's a smaller strip, military, mostly inactive, 14 miles northwest. Runway it's not long. How not long? 4,200 feet. She did the math. A regional jet at approach speed with partial hydraulics and degraded engine performance, landing on 4,200 feet. The numbers were not comfortable numbers. She keyed the mic. Reeves, 7702. I need a closer option. What can you tell me about the military strip northwest of my position? Over. Reeves came back fast. 7702. The strip is Harlow Auxiliary Field. Decommissioned National Guard. Last active use 4 years ago. Runway is asphalt, 4,200 feet. No ILS, no approach lighting system. Wind at that location is variable, estimated 190 at 8 knots. There are no emergency services staged there. A pause. Zariah, I have to be honest with you. That runway was not built for the aircraft you're flying. I know, she said. What's my alternative? Caldwell is 48 miles. In your current engine state. In my current engine state, my right engine is showing performance degradation, and I have approximately 12 minutes before my hydraulic pressure drops to a level where I start losing meaningful control authority. She checked the gauge. 2,400 and still moving. 48 miles at reduced airspeed is 15 minutes minimum. I don't have 15 minutes of hydraulics. Silence on the frequency. She could hear him working through on the other end. The math, the options, the responsibility of confirming a decision that had no good answer. Harlow has a surface inspection flag from its last maintenance review, he said. There may be cracking on the asphalt. I can't guarantee runway surface integrity. Copy that. Zariah. Mr. Reeves. Her voice was quiet and exact. I need you to get emergency services moving toward Harlow Field right now. I need the best surface condition information you can get me in the next 5 minutes. And I need you to trust that I understand what I'm flying into. She adjusted the heading. Can you do that? A beat. Then, moving emergency services to Harlow. Stand by for surface report. Warren looked at her from the left seat. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. She began configuring for the approach. The descent checklist ran in her head in her father's voice. He had a specific cadence when he ran checklists. Unhurried, each item given its full weight, nothing skipped because it seemed obvious. She'd absorbed that cadence so completely that she couldn't run a checklist any other way. Fuel, cross-feed open, imbalance present but stable. Engine 2, 63% N2, performance degraded, monitoring. Engine 1, showing early degradation flag, holding for now. Hydraulics, 2200 and declining. Flaps, she'd need them, but flap extension increased hydraulic demand. She'd deploy in stages, conserving pressure, timing the extension for when she needed it most. Landing gear, the biggest hydraulic demand of the approach. She'd extend it as late as she could justify. Speed, she needed to come in slightly fast. 4,200 feet sounded like a lot until you were flying a regional jet with compromised braking and a surface you couldn't trust. Too fast meant overshooting. Too slow with degraded hydraulics meant risking control loss before the threshold. There was a narrow band of acceptable. She was going to have to find it and stay in it. Flaps to 10, she said to herself, and moved the lever. The aircraft buffeted slightly as the surfaces deployed. The hydraulic pressure dipped, 2100, and stabilized. She began the descent. In the cabin, the change in the aircraft's attitude was immediately felt. The nose had come down to a shallower angle. The engines had pulled back, and the quality of the movement was different from anything in the preceding hour. Purposeful, committed, going somewhere specific. Danielle had returned to her seat. She had Zariah's empty seat beside her, and she was gripping the armrest of it the way you grip something when you can't hold the person you want to hold. She thought about the morning she'd gotten the call about Marcus. The particular hollowness of that moment. The way the air in the room had seemed to change density. She thought about the 2 years since, about every conversation she'd tried to have with Zariah that had ended in quiet, about every evening she'd looked through the gap under Zariah's door and seen the blue glow of the simulator monitors and not known whether to knock. She hadn't understood. She'd thought it was grief looping back on itself, a child who couldn't let go. She understood now. Zariah hadn't been unable to let go. She'd been getting ready. Not consciously, maybe, not with a plan, but something in her had known that her father's knowledge needed to live somewhere, and she had made herself into the place it lived. Danielle pressed her fingers hard against the armrest and looked out the window at the gray afternoon sky and said, under her breath, with everything she had, "She's got it, Marcus. She's got it." Mr. Calloway had not spoken in 40 minutes. He sat with his laptop closed, hands flat on the tray table, looking at the seat back in front of him. Somewhere in the last hour, the person he'd been when he boarded this flight, the man who'd been closing deals and performing certainty into his phone, had quietly vacated. What was left was just a man in a charcoal suit, waiting to find out if he was going to live. He thought about the girl's voice on the PA, complete quiet in the cabin for the next 30 minutes. The flatness of it, the absolute absence of drama. He'd spent his career reading people, assessing who had real authority and who was performing it. It was the skill that had made him successful. And what he'd heard in that voice was the most genuine authority he'd encountered in as long as he could remember. 12 years old. He looked down at his hands and said nothing and waited. Harlow Field Surface Report, Reeves said. Best information I have is from a drone inspection 18 months ago. 2 sections of cracking noted, both in the first 1,000 feet of the runway, left side. The remaining 3,200 feet is rated serviceable. If you can stay right of centerline on rollout, you should avoid the worst of it. Copy. Right of centerline on rollout. What's my traffic? You're the only traffic within 40 miles. Harlow airspace is clear. I'm going to talk you down. I'll call your distance every half mile from 2 miles out. Over. Copy that. Beginning final approach configuration. She reached for the landing gear lever. The hydraulic pressure dropped, 1900, as the gear extended. She heard the 3 thumps in sequence, felt the drag increase, watched the gear indicator lights. 3 green. Gear down and locked. Hydraulics, 1700 and still moving. Landing gear down, Warren confirmed. Flaps to 30, she said, and moved the lever. Another buffet, another pressure drop. 1500. She had 1 flap extension left, full flaps for the landing, and she needed to save it. She'd deploy it on short final, inside a mile, when she could see the runway. The airspeed was holding at 160. She needed 140 at the threshold. She began the deceleration. At 5 miles out, through the broken cloud layer below and ahead, she saw it. Harlow Auxiliary Field was a gray strip in a flat, brown landscape. No terminal, no tower structure, just a rectangle of old asphalt bordered by dry grass and a rusted perimeter fence. It looked from altitude like something forgotten, like a place that had stopped mattering to everyone except the person who needed it most right now. She'd never landed on a real runway. She had landed on simulated runways a few hundred times, in every configuration, in every weather, in emergencies and normal operations and everything in between. She knew, academically, that the real thing would feel different. She was about to find out how different. 2 miles, Reeves called. She checked. Airspeed 152. Altitude 800 feet. Hydraulic pressure 1200, still dropping. She needed to land before it fell below 800 or she'd start losing brake authority. 1.5 miles. Full flaps, she said, and deployed them. The aircraft slowed sharply, nose pitching slightly, and she corrected with back pressure. The hydraulics read 1000. The runway was ahead and below, growing in the windscreen. Her father's voice, "You don't fight the plane. You listen to it." The aircraft was telling her things. The left engine was telling her it was tired. The hydraulics were telling her they were nearly done. The trim fault was still there, a persistent lean that she'd been compensating for so long it had become part of her inputs, automatic now, built into her hands without her thinking about it. She listened to all of it, and she flew. 1 mile. Airspeed 143. Good. Sink rate. She adjusted. The runway threshold was coming up. 1/2 mile. She was slightly high. She reduced thrust on the right engine. The left was already at minimum, and let the aircraft descend. The threshold markers were visible now, the faded white paint of a runway that hadn't been used in years. "You're looking good," Reeves said. His voice had changed, quieter, something in it that wasn't professional distance anymore. "You're looking really good." She didn't respond. All of her was on the aircraft. The threshold passed under the nose. She pulled back, gently, feeling for the flare, asking the aircraft to stop flying and start landing. The main gear touched first, a firm, solid contact that she felt in her spine, and then she was on the runway, decelerating, and she reached for the thrust reversers. The left reverser deployed. The right reverser hesitated. 1/2 second, 1 second, and then deployed unevenly, and the aircraft yawed hard to the left, toward the cracked section of runway, toward the edge. She pushed full right rudder and felt the hydraulic system give her what it had left, the last reserves, reluctant and slow, and the aircraft responded. Slowly, the yaw rested. The nose came back towards centerline. The right side cracking past under the left main gear with a sound like scattered gravel. They were still on the runway. The aircraft was slowing. 100 knots. 80. 60. The brakes were working, but not fully. She could feel the reduced authority, the slightly longer stopping distance. And the end of the runway was visible now, approaching, the rusted fence beyond it getting larger in the windscreen. 40 knots. 20. The aircraft stopped. 40 feet from the end of the runway. The nose was slightly left of centerline. The left engine was winding down. The right engine was still. Zoraya took her hands off the controls. The silence lasted about 3 seconds. 3 seconds of absolute stillness in which the aircraft sat on the runway, and nobody moved, and nobody spoke, and the only sound was the whine of the engines spinning down and the distant, growing wail of emergency vehicle sirens from somewhere beyond the perimeter fence. Then the cabin came apart. Not in panic, in the opposite of panic. The release of something that had been held under tremendous pressure for the better part of an hour. Someone started crying and couldn't stop. And then someone else joined them, and then the sound spread through the cabin the way sound does when people stop trying to control themselves, when the thing they've been bracing against doesn't happen, and the bracing has nowhere left to go. Danielle put her face in her hands. She sat that way for a moment. Then she took her hands down, unfastened her seatbelt, and walked to the cockpit door. Zoraya was still in the right seat. Her hands were in her lap. She was looking at the instrument panel, not reading it anymore, just looking at it, and her expression was the expression of someone who had held an enormous thing for a very long time and had just been allowed to put it down. Danielle stepped over the threshold and crouched beside the seat and put both arms around her niece without saying anything. Zoraya leaned into it, just slightly, just enough. "You landed it," Danielle said. "We're 40 feet from the fence," Zoraya said. "Baby," Danielle pulled back just enough to look at her face. "You landed it." Zoraya looked at her aunt. Her eyes were steady and dry, but something in them had shifted, a quality that had been held back for a very long time. Not grief exactly, but the thing that lives right next to grief, the thing that has to wait until the work is done before it can surface. They killed him, she said. Her voice was quiet and even and utterly certain. It wasn't an accident. I know, Danielle said. We're going to make sure people know. Outside the windscreen, the first emergency vehicles were coming through the perimeter gate. The radio crackled. 7702. Reeves's voice. Not controller professional anymore. Just a man who'd been holding his breath for 14 minutes and had remembered how to breathe. You just saved 200 lives. I want you to know that. Over. Zariah reached for the mic. Copy that, Mr. Reeves. A pause. Thank you for staying with me. Anytime, he said, and she could hear that he meant it in a way that had nothing to do with his job. Warren had his head back against the seat. He'd been running on adrenaline and engineering instinct for an hour, and now that the aircraft was stopped, all of it was catching up to him at once. He looked at Zariah with an expression that was tired and genuine and a little undone. I've been in aviation maintenance for 22 years, he said. I've never seen anything like what you just did. She looked at him. You helped. I handed you wrenches, he said. You built the house. She almost smiled at that. Almost. They brought Hollins off the aircraft in handcuffs. He walked down the portable stairs. They'd rolled to the door with the same composed, unhurried quality he'd maintained throughout the flight. FBI agents in dark jackets were waiting at the bottom, and he went with them without resistance, without drama. At the base of the stairs, he paused. One of the agents had his arm, but he turned his head and looked back up at the aircraft, at the door where Gerald was standing, and then, as if he'd sensed it, his eyes moved to the cockpit window. Zariah was watching from the right seat. He looked at her for a moment. His expression was difficult to read. Not remorseful, not defiant. Something more complicated. Something that might, in another person, have been acknowledgement. Your father almost stopped us, he said, loudly enough to carry. Looks like you finished it. The agent moved him forward. He went. Zariah sat very still in the right seat for a long moment after he was gone. Finished it. She turned that over. She thought about what finishing it meant. Not just landing the aircraft, not just surviving, but what came next. The documentation her father had spent 2 years building. The network he'd been about to expose. The meeting he'd never made it to. There would be another meeting. There would be investigators and hearings and records subpoenaed and testimony given. There would be a process, long and imperfect and necessary. And somewhere at the beginning of it would be the documentation Marcus Washington had left behind, which she had found 14 months ago on the same hard drive that held his flight recordings in a folder he'd labeled with her name. She had been waiting to know what to do with it. She knew now. The news found her the way news finds things. Fast and everywhere and all at once. By the time the passengers had been evacuated from the aircraft and the medical teams had reached the pilots and the FBI had secured the scene, someone had already posted something from their phone. By the time the ambulances left for the nearest hospital, a local news crew had arrived at the perimeter. By the time Zariah and Danielle were sitting in the back of an emergency services vehicle wrapped in foil blankets and drinking bad coffee from paper cups, the story was already moving. 12-year-old girls lands plane after both pilots collapse. The satellite trucks arrived within the hour. The perimeter was crowded with cameras and reporters doing their pieces to camera against the backdrop of the aircraft sitting on the runway, 40 feet from the fence, left of centerline, engines cold. An FAA official found them. Then an FBI coordinator. Then a woman from the airline's crisis management team who was trying very hard to look like she was in charge of a situation that had already made it clear it did not need her to be in charge of anything. Through all of it, Zariah sat quietly and answered the question she was asked and didn't perform anything. Not heroism, not modesty, not trauma, not triumph. She answered accurately and completely and waited for the next question. Danielle answered some of the questions on her behalf. The ones that were more about family, more about background, the ones that required context she couldn't give herself. She did it well. She did it the way someone does something when they've just discovered they're capable of more than they thought. A reporter at the perimeter managed to get close enough to call out, Zariah, how does it feel to be a hero? Zariah looked at the reporter. Consider the question with the same seriousness she gave all questions. I just flew the plane, she said, and she turned back to her coffee. 3 days later, Zariah came home. The apartment looked the same. The kitchen with the parking lot view, the hallway with the overhead light that needed a new bulb, the door to her room that never quite closed flush because the frame had shifted in the summer heat 2 years ago and nobody had gotten around to fixing it. She dropped her bag on her bed, sat on the edge of the mattress for a moment. The room was quiet in the particular way of rooms that have been empty for a few days, a hell-breath quality, waiting. She looked at her desk. The 3 monitors, the yoke, the throttle quadrant, the rudder pedals. the small stack of aviation books in the corner, the photograph underneath them. She got up and crossed the room and sat down at the simulator. She didn't load a scenario right away. She sat in front of the dark screens and put her hands on the yoke and felt the familiar weight and resistance of it. She thought about the moment the main gear had touched the runway at Harlow Field. The feeling that had come through the seat frame and up her spine and into her hands. Real, undeniable, the full weight of the aircraft and everyone in it passing through the contact point between metal and asphalt. Nothing in the simulator had ever felt like that. Nothing in the simulator ever would. But the simulator had gotten her there. Every hour in this chair had been a deposit against a moment she hadn't known was coming. Her father had started that account. She had kept adding to it, faithfully, every evening because she hadn't been able to do anything else with the love she had for him and nowhere to put it. She reached under the stack of books and took out the photograph. He looked happy. He was exactly where he wanted to be. She propped the photograph against the base of the center monitor. Then she reached into the inner pocket of her hoodie and took out a folded piece of paper, a copy of the contact information for the FAA investigator she'd spoken with at Harlow Field. The investigator who had, at the end of their conversation, said, "Your father's case has been reopened as of this afternoon. We're going to need everything he left behind." She set the paper next to the photograph. Then she powered on the monitors, loaded the flight simulator, and started building a new scenario. She wasn't running it to escape. She wasn't running it because it was the only thing that made sense. She was running it because she had work to do, and this was where the work happened, and the work was not finished. It had just found its shape. The screens came to life. The instruments populated. The familiar landscape of an aircraft cockpit spread across the 3 monitors, waiting. She put on her headset. She took the controls. I didn't just fly the plane, she thought, as the engines spooled up on the screen. I finished what he started. What do you do when the world underestimates you your entire life, and then hands you the moment to prove them all wrong at 30,000 feet? If this story moved you, hit like and subscribe. We have more stories that will stay with you long after they're over.